All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. Really pleased to be here this morning with General Frank McKenzie. He's author of the new book, The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. It's a wonderfully written account of his time as the CENTCOM commander, which took place in a really dramatic, even tumultuous time in terms of U.S. policy and activities in the Middle East. And he takes the reader through a number of specific episodes that we'll talk about and draws out a lot of the lessons for strategy and policy and command. So really eager to have this conversation with you this morning. So thank you for being here. General McKenzie served as the 14th commander of U.S. Central Command. He retired in 2022 after 42 years on active duty in the Marines. He was previously, among many other things, the director of the Joint Staff. He's now the executive director of the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. So General McKenzie, thank you for joining us. Congratulations again on this great book. And I thought maybe I would start by a conversation on some of the big themes. You kind of have themes about the nature of civil-military relations, the nature of what it's like to be a combatant commander, how unique that role is. Maybe we could start of what's the melting point? And you start with a Barbara Tuchman sort of quote. Why'd you do that?
Well, first of all, Richard, great to be here at CNAS. I've had a long experience with CNAS. It's always good to come back here, and thanks for hosting me here today. So the title is actually from The Guns of August, written by, I think, preeminent historian Barbara Tuchman. She wrote the book around 1960. And The Guns of August talks about how Europe drifted into war in the spring, summer, and early fall of 1914. And I think the book is as real and germane today as it was when it was written many years ago. But in the book, she uses a line, that melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander. And I always liked that phrase. And as I sat down and wanted to sort of talk about my observations, I would say that I was a commander, and I was a commander in a unique place. A combatant commander under the U.S. system, and there are 11 combatant commanders, 7 are geographic, 4 are functional. But as a combatant commander, you have the opportunity to give policy advice to senior leaders, and then you have the responsibility for execution. And that is a unique responsibility, not shared really by anyone else. Many people give policy advice, many people execute, but the chain of command runs from the president to the secretary to the combatant commander. So only the combatant commander is in the room, albeit as a junior partner in the unequal dialogue of Elliot Cohen when you give policy advice. But you get a chance to do that. And then once those decisions are made, you walk out and you're responsible for execution of that policy. So it's a unique perspective, and I had the opportunity, as you noted, to be present for not as an observer, but as a participant in some pretty significant events. And I found that writing about it was actually a relief and a release for me, and I wanted to share the perspective that I had.
Great. And well, among the things that were unique about your time as CENTCOM commander is you had 2 very different administrations in many ways, 2 very different presidents. But one thing that they seemed to be pretty unified on was a desire to get out of Afghanistan. And that was something that you, per what you just said, both advised on and then had to execute in Afghanistan. So maybe you can take us back to when you first came into the role. I mean, what was the thinking about the U.S. role in Afghanistan? And even during the Trump administration, even almost to the final days of the the Biden administration's time in Afghanistan, they didn't talk about just leaving Afghanistan and the Taliban taking over, right? The idea was that we would leave Afghanistan, we just continue to support the country from outside rather than from inside. The only difference is we wouldn't have troops in harm's way. It seemed to be kind of the overall idea. But what was that debate like when you first came into the role?
Sure. So again, I would say that we left Afghanistan because 2 presidents, as unlike as any 2 presidents in American history, shared one area of policy continuity, a desire to exit Afghanistan regardless of consequences. And so when I assumed command of Central Command in the spring of 2019, we were in Afghanistan with a pretty significant force under a 4-star commander who worked for me, a very, very good, capable Army officer named Scott Miller. And the Doha Agreement, which was signed in February of 2020, was the operational mechanism that was designed to get us out of Afghanistan. It was negotiated without the participation from the Afghan government by the United States and the Taliban, and it was a roadmap for our exit on a timeline. And it charged us to do certain things, and it charged the Taliban to do certain things, and hopefully the Afghan government would do certain things, although again, I note they were not part of that negotiating process. So what really happened in February of 2020 is you had a timeline established that we ultimately adhered to, and we carried out our obligations under that. The Taliban had about 7 things they were supposed to do. They didn't do 6 of them, but one they did do very well and scrupulously. In fact, they did not attack American forces in Afghanistan anymore. They doubled down on the Afghans, but they stopped attacking us. So what you had and during the Trump administration was the initiation of this Doha agreement. We began to reduce our forces until by inauguration day, January 2021, we're at about 2,500, potentially on a path to go to 0 by May, or it's on any other schedule that the incoming president might choose. So really, you get what you have though is continuity again. President Biden came into office and he examined the problem. I had an opportunity to give advice, as did many others. My recommendation is, and as you know from the many dozens of hours of my public testimony
I want to ask you
on
about
the record, on the Hill,
at some point.
that I recommended keeping 2,500 there because when you boil it all down, we were in Afghanistan to prevent attacks being generated against our homeland. Taliban's not the target there. ISIS-K and potentially Al-Qaeda, although Al-Qaeda's a little bit on their back heel. So I recommended that. My commander, Scott Miller, recommended that, and I believe that was General Milley's recommendation as well. Ultimately, we elected not to do that, and that's okay. That's where my discussion of civ-mil relationships come in. The president gets to make a decision. Even if we disagree with the decision, he has every right to expect the military is going to enthusiastically carry out his orders, and I think we did as best we could with the situation that we got. But my observation is, we're all familiar with the tragedy of August 2021, the images that are burned in everyone's mind, and particularly with those who were on the ground there, and they're going to carry that burden with them for the rest of their lives. But we got into that situation because when we made the decision in April of 2021 to exit, we brought out our military, and that was pretty much accomplished by the middle of July. But we did not at that point make a decision to bring out our embassy platform of several thousand, our American citizens, tens of thousands, and the at-risk Afghans who had assisted us in this multi-decade long war, many tens of thousands. So what you do is you take away all your capability to influence events, then you get into a situation where, as you noted, the dream was, and it was a dream, frankly, we're going to support the Afghans from outside. And so we follow orders. We did the best we could to make that happen. It was not possible to do that. The Afghan Air Force was a small asymmetric advantage that they had against the Taliban. We could no longer work with them on the flight lines in Afghanistan to maintain their aircraft. We were going to try to do it by video means, by iPads. So actually American Airlines, U.S. Airlines have tried to do this in the United States, and it doesn't work well in a technologically advanced society. You can imagine how hard it was to do that with Afghan mechanics. So for a variety of reasons, our support, for a variety of policy reasons, our support ended for the Afghan government. We couldn't fly strikes for them anymore. We were unable to help them with their logistics on the ground. And so, as you know, in July, provincial capitals began to fall. The gates of Kabul became open, if you will. And by early August, it was obvious that the game was up and the government was going to go down. And at that point, on the 14th of August, we decided to bring out the embassy. And we decided to bring out our citizens, and we decided to begin bringing out, at scale, the Afghans. There had been a special immigrant visa program operative, but it was a trickle compared to the demand. So what you've got is a perfect confluence of events in the middle of August, caused by, depending on your perspective, either American exceptionalism or American arrogance, the belief that you can quit the field of battle and still dictate events. I would argue that the laws of history operate even against the United States, and there are consequences to certain decisions. But we chose to believe we could still do it from afar and with minimal cost. And of course, the battlefield doesn't respect those dreams.
Yes, I want to go back to just a couple of the moments that you touched on. So you talk about Afghanistan in the book at some length. It's just a fascinating, I think, an extremely insightful discussion. So you described the Doha deal that was negotiated in 2020 as one of the worst negotiating mistakes the United States has made. I mean, if the U.S. was telegraphing, we're going to leave, do you think it would be possible to negotiate something better? Or was the fact that we took our leverage away by telegraphing that in the first place and therefore had nothing to negotiate a better deal with?
First of all, the agreement was flawed. I had no prior knowledge of the agreement. I supported the agreement afterward because I felt, first of all, I looked at it, but I wasn't consulted, and I didn't expect to be consulted necessarily on that agreement before it was signed. But I felt if we strictly imposed the conditionality that was inherent in the agreement, it might be a way forward. For example, Taliban had to negotiate in good faith with the government of Afghanistan. They had to do a variety of things, none of which they actually did. But we let that slide. So I think it was a bad agreement, but it was made a lethal agreement by our inability to even apply those elements of it that could have been made to work against the Taliban. And that was because of what I would best characterize as a supine negotiating posture when we approached the Taliban in Doha. And so we were on a timeline. They knew we were on a timeline. It had the two effects. It emboldened the Taliban because they knew and believed military victory was possible. And it deflated the Afghans because they knew we were leaving. So it had it's impossible to overstate the pernicious effects of that.
Yeah, okay. And then, so fast forward to the Biden administration comes in and they say, well, maybe we didn't want it this way, but we're stuck with the Doha deal. So they had kind of two claims, I guess. One was we're stuck with the Doha deal, and if we say the Taliban's not abiding by it, or if we abrogate it, then they'll turn around and attack our troops. The only reason we haven't had casualties is because, per the agreement, they haven't been attacking us, and that's what we care about the most. So we're sort of stuck. We can't really do anything about this agreement. And then second, although they extended the timeline for the withdrawal by a few months, and then second was if we were to say, well, actually going to zero is wrong, we couldn't leave the residual force of 2,500. We'd have to significantly bolster our presence, and anybody who says otherwise is sort of, it's kind of magical thinking. We'd have to go in there in far larger numbers, and then we'd be right back in the same situation we've been trying to get out of. So what do you make of those two claims?
I would have to consider myself a subject matter expert on Afghanistan. I was the concerned commander, and I disagreed with that argument.
Right.
I understand the argument.
Right.
You can't stay at 2,500. You say 2,500, they're going to attack you. You're going to have more forces. Okay, that's a reasonable position. It's also a counterfactual. We don't know. My position and the position of my commander, Scott Miller, was you can stay at that number because counterintuitively, if you go low, your attack surface lessens. It's harder for the Taliban to get at you. And many of the easier targets are now off the battlefield. Plus, the assumption was if we stay at 2,500, we're actually going to turn up the pressure on the Taliban, which had turned down to a very, very low level. The Taliban in the summer of 2020, spring and summer of 2021, had profound vulnerabilities, and we could have struck those vulnerabilities. Additionally, and last, we could have gone back and adjusted our negotiating posture and been more aggressive in terms of negotiating with the Taliban, at least at a bare minimum, requiring them to adhere to the Doha agreement. So when we say 2,500, it was 2,500, but with other things. And let's not also forget, Richard, that at 2,500, there were over 4,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan with us. Yeah. And NATO would have stayed had we stayed, and in fact, there would have been more NATO engagement than United States engagement going forward in Afghanistan, which I did not think was a bad thing.
Right. So the other argument that I heard at the time, not so much from the administration, but from others who supported going to zero and just getting out of Afghanistan was, look, the Taliban, okay, it hasn't taken the cities, but if you look every year, they're taking more territory, right. They're growing stronger. They're going to be successful at some point in the future. And so by staying, not only are we incurring huge costs for ourselves, but we're keeping this country in a terrible civil war where the ANA is taking tremendous casualties and things like that. If the Taliban's going to win sooner or later, better to let them take over now.
So I would just look at Afghanistan now, see how good life is in Afghanistan for a lot of people when I would respond to that argument like that. I do understand that argument. I think it would not have been a guaranteed thing at 2,500. And I do recognize you got to think you might have had to put more people in. Scott Miller and I thought we might be able to hold at 2,500. That was my best professional judgment. We'll never know the answer. It's a counterfactual. We do, however, know empirically what happens when you go to zero, because that's what happened.
Is there not also a broader lesson here, both in the withdrawal of American troops in 2011 and the withdrawal of the last troops from Afghanistan, about the political effect that having almost any presence of American troops on the ground? I mean, it seems in both cases that once we telegraph that we're going to zero and we're withdrawing completely, people on the ground, including the policymakers and political leaders, have to adjust to what they believe to be the new reality and are going to side with who is going to stay rather than who's leaving.
So yes, I think you're right in both cases, and there's actually a third instance. The surge under General McChrystal actually probably did as much damage as good because we put a timeline on it. We ran it like a business case instead of a recognition that we were in a clash of wills with an animate other body that had their own thinking. You can't actually make deals internal to the United States because it seems reasonable and expect those to pertain to another country.
Two more questions I just want to ask you about Afghanistan. So one, you spent all this time trying to figure out how to beat the Taliban, and then suddenly you're in Doha face-to-face with the Taliban, and you're negotiating about who's going to enter Kabul and who's going to have security and what the perimeter might look like around the airport for our NEO and all these other kind of things. So what was that experience like?
It was my job. It was business. I was asked to fly to Doha on 15 August to meet Mullah Barater and the Taliban leadership in at their luxury hotel in Doha where they were living, the Ritz-Carlton. And so the deal was, by the time I got there, they were in downtown Kabul. So our plan was to tell them don't enter Kabul. Well, as they looked at the map that I laid out and they said, this map's obviously old. And I was forced to agree. Since we wanted to not have them come into the city, they were already in the center of the city. So at that point, my guidance was the brief I got was we're going to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation. And I told the Taliban, we're going to do this. If you interfere with us, we will strike you and hurt you as badly as we can. And they said, we want you to leave. We're happy to help with you. And they agreed to provide some external security. Now, it's often misunderstood that we said, well, put a ring around it or do something like that. Didn't ask them to do that. We asked them to provide external security. They were one tool of many that we used to try to screen our own perimeter. I would make the same agreement today if I had to go in there and do that. And we looked at, if we had, many people have said, well, why didn't you actually take over the city itself? Mullah Barater said that in an aside. I actually have done the calculations for that, and it would have taken the introduction of a reinforced division with what we'd call a core slice, probably 25,000, 30,000 U.S. forces to do that. I'm not sure we were willing to actually reintroduce that much combat power in, and I don't think the suggestion that Barater made was anything more than an aside. It was not a serious proposal, and it would have delayed us. We were already on a timeline to be out by the 31st, and I felt if we adhered to that timeline and got out by the 31st as the president had directed, we would gain some leverage in future negotiations to bring out at-risk Afghans that we couldn't bring out by then because we'd kept our word and left when we said we were going to leave. If we'd stayed past that time, it was my judgment, probably would have had to start fighting the Taliban a little bit then. Because one thing I can tell you, through 31 August, we did not fight the Taliban. A couple of times, low-level Taliban forces got out of hand. Typically, they were killed by our security forces in response. So we were able to defend ourselves when we needed to defend ourselves, but there was no Taliban policy of attacking us. In fact, the Taliban policy was to assist in our exit, and they actually stopped attacks against us. Not all of them, as we know tragically, but some.
I said I had two more questions about Afghanistan. I actually now have two more, but they're more about the civ mil aspect of this. So one, there's this. I don't know whether fascinating is the right adjective for this, but there's this fascinating anecdote in your book during the Trump administration where suddenly out of the ether a letter appears ordering a withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan, and it's not clear if this is real or not, and then you sort of run it to ground and determine it really isn't. So maybe you can describe that and what you took away from that.
So this was in November 2020. Right after Secretary Esper had left the department, he had been fired. Acting Secretary Miller was newly in place, and a Trump administration functionary named Doug McGregor over at the White House procured the president's signature on a piece of paper that said, exit Afghanistan immediately, in effect, go to zero. And he caused that letter to be delivered to the Pentagon without checking in with a national security advisor, Ambassador O'Brien, or anyone else on the national security staff. Well, the letter landed like a bomb up on the E-ring. I was down in Tampa. I had no knowledge of it, but it was concerning that the letter could get to the Pentagon. Now, General Milley and Acting Secretary Miller went back to the White House, talked to the National Security Advisor. We rapidly determined that the letter was out of bounds, had not been staffed at all, except by the person who wrote it and took it into the president. So the letter was removed. But what it did, though, at a time when you're worried. When you're worried about all the stuff that's changing in the department, it's not good to get something like that. It makes you worry a little bit about the chain of command, who's actually giving orders.
Right. Well, and so I guess by necessity then the president within, a day or two, both signed an order that had been given to him saying withdraw from Afghanistan immediately and then said don't do that.
They just withdrew the letter. They withdrew the letter.
Right, yeah, so that effectively.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Just trying to understand where we're.
It was a very dynamic period of time.
In diplomacy, when you have some tempestuous meeting, they describe it as a vigorous exchange of ideas. I guess it's a dynamic time.
Yeah. Well, it was vigorous anyway.
Vigorous. Okay, so the other thing, and you talk especially in your discussion of kind of civil relations and everything, and the role of a commander and the role of the military, is you've multiple times written resignation letters, and one of those was after the errant drone strike in Kabul that killed a group of people that instead of the terrorists that they were targeting. So why did you write these multiple resignation letters?
Sure.
And why did you stay on the job if you were thinking about resigning?
So I used to write letters even when I was a colonel. I wrote a letter, because I was angry and I like writing, and it allowed me to release it, and I file them and look at them later and, and I laugh at myself. But I think here's the thing, in the U.S. system, and particularly at senior officer leadership position, at the 4-star level, you are obligated to carry out an order from the president unless it's an illegal order. I know what an illegal order is. In a central command, I had 14 lawyers on staff to help me determine what an illegal order was. But I didn't need a lawyer to tell me what an illegal order was. I knew. And it is, you can dislike the order, you can violently disagree with the order, you can find it immoral, you can find it counter to your religious views. Doesn't matter. Under law, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and in fact, U.S. custom, more broadly in the custom of the U.S. Officer Corps, the president gets to make a choice, and he should expect to have his orders carried out. And I think that's an important principle regardless of the officer's view of that order, unless the order is patently illegal. And then all bets are off and you can act as your conscience dictates. But any 4-star general who resigns as a matter of policy variance from the president is in fact making a political statement. And I think that it's dangerous to the republic, because I believe that the only way the nation functions going forward in the long term is for constitutionally authorized civilian authority to make the final decisions. You never want to be in a place where, well, what are the Joint Chiefs going to say about this? Or what are the combatant? No, we don't actually get a vote. I am happy that at different times in my senior career, I had the opportunity to give advice. Sometimes the advice was taken, sometimes it wasn't. But the principle of civilian leadership is far more important than any single decision for the long-term future of the republic. So I never considered ever resigning at any point over policy disagreements the whole time I was a 4-star. The one time I did consider resigning, was in the aftermath of the Abbey Gate strike, when I was concerned that possibly some of my subordinates might be punished for what I considered actions taken in good faith in the heat of battle. And I said, if they're going to punish them, then I might have to consider resigning. It was my own. I wrote it, filed it away again, but that wasn't a policy issue then. That was a different matter. Yeah. And I can't tell you that I would use that letter or not, but I certainly thought about it.
Well, Abraham Lincoln used to write these letters to his commanders announcing him for this or criticizing him for that, and then his wife would take it and make sure it wasn't mailed, and she'd say, you wrote it, now you're done. You don't have to send it.
That's right. That's right. So, I just find writing, as with this book, is cathartic, and it allows, and also allows you to sort of block things out mentally. You can, if you write something, you got to write something down, you got to organize it.
Also on this CivMil sort of theme, so you write that President Trump was often not fully informed of either, one, the options that were available to him in certain circumstances, or two, what the repercussions would be of choosing certain options. So you give an example of when his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, said, don't present the option to go to zero in Afghanistan because he might choose it. Or when the Qasem Soleimani strike and CENTCOM and IC anticipated there would be repercussions, and some of his advisors told him, well, you can do this and there won't be repercussions. Right. So how do you think about, well, especially the presentation of options? I mean, is it the right role of a commander to, or anyone else, to present only the options that they would personally think are wise, as opposed to one that they think would be unwise, but nevertheless the president might choose?
Sure. So in the Soleimani case, I wasn't in the room when the options were actually presented to the president. That happened at Mar-a-Lago. I was at my headquarters in Tampa. But there was reasonable disagreement about what an Iranian response to a strike on Soleimani would be. I had the opportunity to present my views to the secretary. I did not present them to the president in that case because I just didn't have an opportunity to talk to him beforehand. But I felt that I had the opportunity to lay my views out before that. And I can't actually tell you whatever they said, whatever went on in conversations with the president at Mar-a-Lago. I think he actually chose a reasonable option, the strike on Soleimani, given the situation we were in at the time. And people sometimes forget that the reason we struck Soleimani was it was tactical. We thought people were going to die if we did not take that strike. We felt he was going into Iraq to coordinate further attacks on our embassy there and other embassies in the region and other U.S. bases. So the risk of inaction was greater than the risk of action. So it wasn't a fully, deeply formulated strategic position that now's the time to remove Soleimani. He's a clear and present danger right now. This is an immediate tactical problem, and significant loss of life is going to result if we don't take action. Now, the consequences of taking that action could range from nothing to a large-scale Iranian response. In the event, the Iranians chose what I would characterize as a moderate response, and we were able to save the Iranians from themselves by avoiding the blow, which might have led otherwise to escalation, going up the escalation ladder. The fact that we were able to move our forces when they struck Al-Assad Air Base about a week later allowed us to actually move away from that, and I think then that was the president's decision to do that.
So, it was a very dramatic step for the president to have made. And it was particularly dramatic because if you looked at what the Iranians had done in previous months, there was very little, at least publicly, known about military response from the United States. So the Iranians shot down a drone, and there wasn't, there was a response, but then it was sort of pulled back. They launched this breathtaking attack on the Saudi oil fields at Abqaiq, knocked 50% of Saudi oil production offline in a night, which should have been the kind of textbook case of when you get the U.S. involved in something, right, is when you start to interrupt the free flow of oil from the Middle East. Again, nothing, and then all of a sudden the operation to take out Soleimani was the catalyzing factor. What you're describing, which is we have to do this in order to prevent American deaths, or was it the culmination also of this increasing aggression on the Iranian side?
So it was both.
Okay.
It was actually both coming together there, but there was a tactical reason to do it. There were also strategic reasons to do it. And you nicely summarized the rising pressure from Iran in the second half, the second half of 2019. But one point I would make, after the attack on the Saudi oil fields, we actually did a number of things. We stood up we sent an air expeditionary wing into Prince Sultan Air Base that's still there. We positioned an ANTPY-2 radar, tremendous air battle management radar at Prince Sultan Air Base. We brought in fighter squadrons. We brought in Patriot units. So we did a number of things, and we activated the Saudi defense plan. So we did a number of things to show support to the Saudis. What we did not do, and which I did not recommend doing, was striking Iran at that time. And so we did not do it. There were probably opportunities in the summer and fall of 2019, particularly when they shot the RQ-4 down in July of 2019. Had we acted against Iran then, my belief then and now is we might have gone on a different path for the rest of 2019. They would have seen a response from us. The Iranians are rational actors. Their primary goal is state preservation. Number 2 and number 3 goals are destruction of Israel and ejection of the U.S. from the region. But number 1 is paramount. And they'll do nothing to actually place number 1 at active risk. So we had an opportunity maybe a little earlier to signal to them that we're not going to put up with this kind of behavior. And we did not take that opportunity when they shot the RQ-4 down. We had an opportunity to do it. We ultimately didn't do anything. And I think the Iranians drew a lesson from that they could continue to press against us, because as the Iranians look at the United States, they know and understand our capabilities. They actually have great respect for our capabilities. They have no respect for our will. And so that gave them an opportunity to continue to press. And it's like Lenin said, you stick a bayonet in, you keep pushing if it reaches mush, you stop if it reaches steel. And that's the way the Iranians behave.
Let me ask you one more question, then I'll go to the audience both here and online, and I think there are mics here. For those online, there's a chat box. You can put questions there, and they will magically appear on this device I have here, or you can tweet, or I don't know, is X the verb now? But whatever the verb is, you do that at with hashtag CNAS 2024, and we'll get the questions that way. But I wanted to taking the lessons that you just described from that experience forward to today. So now you've got Iran, which was seen as problematic when it was enriching uranium to 3%. Now it's at 60%. Hezbollah is launching attacks on Israel in the north. Obviously, we know the story in Gaza. The Houthis, Iranian-supported Houthis, have been menacing Red Sea shipping. I mean, you can sort of look around the region, and the Iranian hand, at least of support, if not direction, is behind a lot of the things that are deeply problematic and which we are working against. So what's the lesson for how to deal with that, based on what you were just describing as how you affect Iranian behavior?
So again, I go back to the three pillars of Iranian foreign policy. And it's important to understand what has not happened in reaction to the Gaza war. Iran has not chosen to engage with Israel. And I'll talk about the strike on Israel separately, because that was not, in my judgment, a reaction to what happened in Gaza. There was a reaction to something else. The number two pillar of Iranian foreign policy, not support for what's going on with Hamas in Gaza. And the fact that Lebanese Hezbollah, despite the back and forth across the border, has not entered the war at scale. If Lebanese Hezbollah came in at scale, we'd know it. Largest non-state entity in the world, thousands of missiles that can reach Tel Aviv. They've fired none of those. Everything has been relatively short range. So I think it's important to look at what has not happened. And then, of course, the Houthis, and we can talk about the Houthis separately here in just a moment. But my larger point would be the Abraham Accords sort of brought Israel into the theater a little bit diplomatically. The movement of Israel into Central Command, which happened in the spring of January 2021, immediately before President Trump left office, operationalized that effect. And it allowed nations in the region a forum to begin to exchange ideas with Israel about how to defend against Iranian aggression. And Iranian aggression, the proxies, of course, but the real threat of Iranian aggression is in their ballistic missile, their drone, and their cruise missile force, which over the last 15 years they have dramatically increased in terms of capability, accuracy, and capacity number. So that's a big problem that the nations in the region face. And so and they're very concerned about that. So there's a lot of interest in how they can defend themselves against this. In 2010, 2011, with General Mattis, we tried to interest the Gulf states in integrated air and missile defense. There was no interest. I went out there many times as his J5 with a guy named Dave Goldfein, future Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and a great guy. And we tried to energize him, and we couldn't. Very different in 2020, 2021. Very different because of the imminence of the Iranian threat. Things have changed. And Israel there's now a conduit for more effective coordination with Israel because of A, the Abraham Accords, but B, the fact that they're now in the Central Command region. So you have a mechanism for doing that. I convened meetings in the fall of 2021, in the spring of 2022 at Sharm el-Sheikh, the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, with Chads of the region. And Chads of the region mean the Israeli Chads there, Saudi Chads there. And the discussion focused on the Iranian threat, those three things I just talked about, missiles, drones, and land attack cruise missiles, and how we might talk about an integrated air and missile defense. So flash forward now to April of this year, the Iranians have been outfought over the last couple of years by the Israelis, I would argue, across the theater in the shadow war that's gone on between them. All around the theater, but a lot in Syria and a lot in Iraq, and culminating in the strike in Damascus against IRGC planners. Iran felt they had to respond to that, to reset the table, to take a page from the Russian playbook, escalate to de-escalate, if you will. And so the attack on Israel that was developed, I think on 13 April, I may have the day wrong, but 13 April, was not a signal. It was pretty much a maximum effort. Iran has about 1,000 or more missiles that can reach Israel, but they have a throughput problem. They have to put them on tractor erector launchers, what we call TELs. So you can launch, for the sake of argument, let's say 150. And so that's the maximum volley you can fire at one time that's going to get to Israel, not 1,000. So what you do is you pair that with drones and cruise missiles. The theory being you take out the radars with the drones and cruise missiles, which then make it impossible for Patriot, David Sling, Iron Dome, Iron Beam to intercept the incoming ballistic missiles. The attack failed. The attack failed because, first of all, the Israelis are very good at defending themselves, but also because we participated and some NATO allies participated, but also because Arab nations participated. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, perhaps others. And that gave Israel strategic depth, but also the capabilities of those nations, which significantly attrited the Iranian attack. So if you want to see an operational exemplar of what integrated air and missile defense looks like in the region, you saw it in mid-April. And the Israeli counterattack was designed to prevent that coalition from disintegrating. That's why the Israelis went in with very limited, very insightful measures to demonstrate to Iran, we are clearly your technological superior. We could have struck. We might come back tomorrow night and strike again. We chose not to. And what it did, it didn't drive a fissure between Israel and its Arab neighbors or the United States. So, long answer to your question, but as I look in the region at the level that I play at, which is the mill-to-mill level, and a little above and a little below that, there's a way forward here. And it's based on, again, Iranian malign intent, Iranian misbehavior, and a recognition that they are the major threat in the region.
Let's go to questions here, if you have one. So, yes, right here. Hannah? Yes, there's a mic coming in just a second.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a researcher here at CNAS.
Sure.
Thank you for being here. So as CENTCOM commander, your responsibility was the CENTCOM area of responsibility. That's your priority. But since before you came into that role, the administration's strategy, at least verbally, was to prioritize the threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm curious how you frame your recommendations or how you balance them when your mandated priority isn't your boss's priority.
Sure. So, before I came to CENTCOM, I was actually the director of the Joint Staff. And so that's actually a great three-star job where you have a total global visibility. So you're right. The priority in the spring of 2019, as written in the National Defense Strategy, which is a Department of Defense document, was China. Look, I agree with that completely. China is the pacing threat for the United States. We need to recognize that. We need to be prepared to compete with and fight and defeat China if necessary. Got all that. But you had in the summer of 2019, I would argue, you had a president who was also focused on Iran and was doing things with a maximum pressure campaign to Iran that was going to cause them to react. Now, there was no planned military component to the maximum pressure campaign. It was economic, starve them, sanctions, and it was diplomatic, pressure them. So without explicit guidance on this, I saw the military's role in that was to deter Iran from acting militarily to try to break out with a maximum pressure campaign. And that required certain forces. And we had drawn down forces in CENTCOM significantly. And the Department of Defense runs on written guidance. And so the services argue we need to go to the Pacific, we need to go to the Pacific. I'm arguing we need to keep enough forces in the region. If we're going to continue the maximum pressure campaign, there are consequences of that. And so it was just a fight I had, a continual fight. You're right, my job is to argue for CENTCOM. But at the same time, if you're going to be a four-star officer, and particularly coming from the Joint Staff where I was the director, and before that, the senior uniform strategic planner for the United States, I had a good grasp of the globe. And my larger argument would be, if the United States is going to remain a global power, you don't have the luxury of focusing regionally. Certainly, you need to have capability against the most significant threat, but that may not need to be applied purely geographically. We shouldn't narrow ourselves down to just the Western Pacific. There are other places we can apply pressure on China. So that was sort of my perspective. I argued this case with some success and some failure while I was in command. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yep, right here.
Hi, sir. Thank you so much. My name is Kate Bateman. I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I work on Afghanistan, so I'm wondering if I could ask a question about a prior period. You've touched Afghanistan at so many points in your career. In 2010 to 2014 or so, as we ramped up the surge and then drew down, we have a project looking at the failure to achieve a political settlement over the 20 years. My understanding of it is that there's never a real discussion at high levels to link our military leverage in terms of the surge and the drawdown to the peace efforts, which were secret at the time with the Taliban. And there seems to have been a lot of resistance from the Pentagon to those talks, or at least, let's say, skepticism that they could work. I'm wondering what your recollection of that period is, if you think why do you think that was, that the peace efforts were just such a sideshow at the time?
Right.
And why did we not try better to link our military and political strategy?
So I was in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010 as a one-star general working for General McChrystal on the ISAF staff. So I saw a little bit of this, not a lot of it. So I think General McChrystal actually tried to do that. We tried to outreach to the Taliban. Can't tell you about views necessarily back in the Pentagon during that period of time, but we tried to do it. But I think but to go take your question up one level, we had opportunities in 2002 the best opportunity probably was in 2001, 2002, 2003 to do one of two things: either crush the Taliban completely or find a way to bring them in. And we chose not to do that. Part of it was because we chose a form of government for Afghanistan that looked great in Bonn, but didn't look so great on the ground in Afghanistan. I'm of the belief that Afghanistan is not ungovernable. It's simply ungovernable from a Western model. And you've got to we never actually digested that fact in our entire period of time of engagement there. So we had opportunities to do this, none better than at the beginning. And the other thing, of course, about the surge was it was self-destructive because we put a timeline on it. And they understood the timeline. As soon as you say, we're going to send in forces, but we're going to bring them back out, you give a lifeline to the opponent. I mean, it's a decision that is devoid of an understanding of the realities of war. I wish I could give you a better answer there, but I can't. Sorry.
Jonathan.
General McKenzie, so good to see you again. I'm Jonathan Lord. I direct the Middle East Security Program here, and I will ask a question about Afghanistan and not the Middle East, an area of the region I've worked very hard to avoid in my career. But to your point about some of the business practice and the interagency negotiation and how the enemy will not respect the decisions or the trade space and the shoot to get what you need or whomever needs. If we go back to your time advising the president before the withdrawal, and you were arguing for 2,500 U.S. forces, 2,500 NATO forces, what is your theory of victory? What is your argument to him if he asks you, where does this end? How do we leave? What is the exit strategy? When do we declare victory, and what does it look like?
Sure. So I would have said 2,500, but 4,000 to 5,000 NATO was what was there. But okay, my theory would be, first of all, you're going to have some form of a blended government. You're going to have to force the government of Afghanistan to actually negotiate with the Taliban and vice versa. So keeping 2,500 is only a component of that strategy. Instead, you probably need to put negotiators in place that will impose firm, hard conditions on the Taliban and punish them if they don't actually come in and accept those conditions. So you've got to accept that there are probably going to be U.S. casualties going forward. It remains to be seen ultimately how many U.S. casualties will occur because of the decision that we left. That jury is still out right now, I would argue. But my vision would be, it's going to have to be some form of the Taliban being in the government. Don't know what that's going to look like. But I was used to a series of less than perfect answers in Afghanistan. But you had to force them to negotiate together. We never actually were able to do that. You had to convince the Taliban that you're not going to force us to leave by ramping up attacks. I and Scott Miller felt that was feasible. Others disagreed. Look, we could have been wrong on that. I'm willing to say I could have been wrong on that. But I felt strongly enough about it to make that recommendation. But as I said before, we do know what happens when you go to zero. We don't have to argue about that. We have the historical record behind us now. So opportunity to do that, it would not have been risk-free, and I recognize that.
There's a question online. Given the uproar over the civilian casualties in Gaza, do you have any thoughts about how a rule of law country could fight an adversary using human shields and embedded in an urban environment?
So any country that has an open, transparent process, and that's us and Israel as well, is going to be particularly vulnerable when you got to fight that. When the enemy is very smart, and he uses not only the Israeli hostages as human shields, but I would argue is using the entire population of Gaza as a human shield. It's very difficult. Every country is going to reach and so look, I don't want to give you a lesson on military law, but again, I had lawyers that advised me on this all the time, and I had to make many of these decisions. It's proportionality. Is the objective that we want worth the loss of innocent life that is inevitably going to occur if we pursue it? And every nation's got to answer that in a different way. And the United States might apply a different standard than Israel is applying here. but it's a proportionality issue, and beyond that, I got nothing more to say about it. It's just, look, I recognize the emotion that surrounds this topic. It's a very difficult topic. It's one I've grappled with myself, and if you got a minute, I'll give you an example. So in the summer of 2019, we were running down where Baghdadi was. He had been the commander of led the caliphate, and he fled when Joe Votel closed him off in the southern Euphrates River Valley. He wasn't a fight to the death kind of guy. He got out, and he went west into Syria and took with him 14 children as sex slaves and as human shields, 2 wives and 3 or 4 other people as a bodyguard. And he went to ground in a mud wall compound way in western Syria, about 3 miles from the Turkish border. So over the summer and into the fall, we began to track him down, and my task was capture or kill. And so we eventually found him, and it's in the book, and I won't spend too much time. We narrowed him down there. But he was very cautious. He never appeared in public without children around him. And by public, I mean in a mud wall compound. He never went outside the mud wall compound. So it was hard to get him, and so I had the best targeteers in the world look at ways to get him. And I could never get a way to get him that didn't involve killing a bunch of children. And so the commander that I worked by, my task force commander that worked that, and I were not comfortable with that. So we said, we're not going to strike him. We're going to have to go on the ground to get him. And so we went out on the ground, and that meant putting 150 Americans 200 miles behind enemy lines, land out there on a raid, surround it, call them out, try to get them to come out. And his guards came out fighting. We killed them. We got 12 children out, I believe. And then Baghdadi blew himself up in a small hole in the ground with 2 children. So that's an example of the way a commander makes risk decisions. So it's easy now to say, well, why can't the Israelis do that? So I would tell you it's completely different, and here's why. I'm going out in the desert. There's nobody around. It's the middle of nowhere. I can seal it off. So if you do that raid in downtown in Gaza, you see what can happen. The Israelis got in, they got their hostages, and the world explodes around you. And that has happened to the United States before. It happened in October 1993 in Mogadishu, and 2 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for that. But a lot of Americans died. In a city, it's very hard to carry out operations. People who talk about, we'll just special operations forces in. The further away you are from the problem, the easier it looks. You begin to examine it in detail, and you saw what the Israelis had to do to get their people out. It would have been no different if we had gone in. They got very good special operations forces. So it's a long discursion, if you will, on the proportionality issue. But I can tell you, we think about it all the time. Commanders think about it, and the Israelis are on the horns of a dilemma. Every minute they're talking about what's going on in Gaza because it's Hamas's campaign designed to put them on the horns of that dilemma, which is itself a war crime.
I think there's a question back here. Yes.
Good morning, sir. I'm Artem Shabinin. I'm a next-gen fellow here at CNAS. In my day job, I'm the Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Surface Navy. So when you made the decision to strike Soleimani, I was actually on a guided missile destroyer sailing to the Gulf. So kind of had a small perspective on that, which was, and this is the question, one, what was your calculus had deterrence failed? We all on the ship intimately knew that we were staring down the barrel of several thousand anti-ship cruise missiles in a small confined space with high clutter. And then 2, was there, my ship was originally in the Western Pacific, so was there a discussion between yourself and your fellow combatant commanders in the National Command Authority on how we're going to send, pull resources away from what we've determined as the key strategic priority towards what we've determined as a secondary theater?
Sure. So let me answer the second part of your question first. So yes, you talk about resources flowing, but so the Indo-PACOM commander, he's a peer of mine, he's a friend of mine. We're not going to have a discussion on that because we're not going to agree on it. So we know that. So I'm not going to bother him with the conversation. He's got better things to do with this time. I'm going to make my case to the secretary. And through the chairman, the secretary is going to have to make a decision. And he did make those decisions. Sometimes I won, sometimes I didn't win. And that's the way it is. And I was happy with my win-loss rate. And I thought I generally got what I needed in that argument. But the Navy didn't agree with it for a lot of reasons. For, as you noted, they don't like to have ships in the Red Sea. They don't like to have ships in the Arabian Gulf. They don't like ships in tight and constrained waters for very good reasons. That ship is not designed to operate in there. So that was a constant back and forth. It was an intellectual exercise. Luckily, my J3 was a guy named Sam Papero, he's not unaware of the ways of the Navy. And is now the Indo-PACOM commander, and he's one of the most brilliant officers I've ever known. So I worked with Sam as we laid these arguments out, and so we knew how to advance our arguments. As we took the strike on Soleimani, yes, I was very concerned about Iranian response. So the way I thought, the mental model I had and the way I argued for forces for CENTCOM was, I wasn't concerned about having a huge initial laydown. I wanted enough to make the Iranians think that we wouldn't be a pushover. But if they strike us, we're going to respond. So I knew that, so that's what we're in now. The forces I wanted to have, what forces were necessary to prevent the inevitable Iranian response from killing a bunch of Americans to send us up the escalation ladder. So when I thought about force posture, it wasn't the forces in there day to day. It was like the forces event plus one that I needed. And that's pretty close to day-to-day forces, but not quite. There's some differences. And so when I thought about it, that's when I argued for forces. Those were the forces that I was arguing for. So that leads you to ballistic missile-capable platforms, whether it's maritime or at sea, because the risk is it's a missile threat. It's a missile drone, land attack cruise missile threat. It's not a ground invasion threat. And proxies are a factor too. And there are other things we can do about that. But that was the way I thought about escalation. And I'll just close it out by saying it's always clear to me that the Iranians own the lower steps on the escalation ladder. It's clear to everyone in the region, including the Iranians, that we own the highest steps on the escalation ladder. Absolutely. They know this. They are actually rational actors within their view of the world, which I've said before is preservation of the regime, destruction of the state of Israel, ejection of the United States from the region. But again, objectives 2 and 3 will never compromise objective 1 because they view themselves as a revolutionary state. The revolutionary generation is leaving the stage. They know from history that revolutions seldom outlive in its original form the revolutionaries who created the revolution. Look at the French Revolution, look at the Russian Revolution. And so they're very much aware of that. So protection of the regime is a strength and a weakness for Iran, and you can operate against that target. Good question. Thank you.
Last question I'll ask you before we let you go. The administration now is negotiating a deal with the Saudis on regional normalization, Saudi-Israel normalization. Part of that, at least reportedly, would be a binding security guarantee to Saudi Arabia, the likes of which we don't have with Israel or Taiwan or a lot of other countries, but sort of modeled on the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Agreement or something. If you were CENTCOM commander and were told, okay, the Senate has ratified a treaty that now binds us indefinitely to maintain the security of Saudi Arabia, would that mean a big increase in the resources you believe would be necessary to have in the CENTCOM AOR, or, I mean, roughly speaking, are we sort of set where we are?
I think you might need to adjust it a little bit. First of all, I would support that. I think the path to normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel is going to proceed. I think there may be bumps on the road, but I think because Saudi Arabia sees the imminence of the Iranian threat, and they recognize that for them it's an air and missile threat. Proxies too, but mainly air and missile, or missile and drone. And so they need protection against that. That leads you to integrated air and missile defense. That leads you to the United States, seeking protection with the United States, the capabilities that we bring, and partnering with Israel, working with Israel and other nations in the region. So I think the arguments to do that far overweigh any counter arguments. So I think there's a certain inevitability there. But I think we can help ourselves too, depending on what we sell the Saudis, what capabilities we allow them to purchase, more Patriot systems, more advanced fighter aircraft. There are a variety of things in our toolbox that they would like to have. And I'm sure those are going to be the types of things that are going to be under discussion as we look at that normalization. But I would say this, I would not, no one's going to, a combatant commander is actually not going to be, no combatant commander is going to be asked about it. But now as a former combatant commander, I wouldn't support it unless Israel was explicitly part of the agreement.
Mm-hmm. The book is The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century. I've read a lot of books like this. This one is truly exceptional. The stories and the insights and the lessons are amazing, but it is incredibly well written. It's really gripping to do this. So I asked General before, did you know you were a writer? Because it really is an amazing account here. I should note that there are books available right outside this room. Obviously, they're also available online. The proceeds from the sales go to the Semper Fi Americas Fund, the Citadel Foundation, the the Marine Corps Law Enforcement Foundation, and the Warrior Legacy Ranch. So if you don't have a copy, do get it. And thank you very much, General McKenzie, for being with us today.
Thanks, Richard. It's great. Thank you. Thank you.